On the morning of March 3, 1943, the sea between Rabaul and Leh looked calm, almost deceptively calm. The Imperial Japanese Navy convoy steamed confidently through the swell's 8 transports carrying nearly 7,000 troops, shielded by 8 destroyers, bristling with guns. To the men aboard, it was just another run, another resupply, the kind they had done dozens of times. Convoys had always gotten through. Allied bombers had tried to stop them before, but those attacks had come from high in the clouds from 20,000 feet up, where bombs tumbled aimlessly into the sea, and Japanese helmsmen simply turned their wheels and sailed on. The Japanese knew those American raids. They had learned to laugh at them. What they did not know, what they could not imagine, was that the war had just changed. Far out on the horizon, flying impossibly low, just above the foam of the Pacific waves, 13 American B-25 bombers appeared. At first glance, they looked like any other medium bombers. To the Japanese lookouts, it seemed ridiculous, almost comical. Why would bombers be flying so low, exposing themselves to every gun on deck? But in the next moments, the crews on those ships would learn a new word, a new terror: skip bombing. Imagine standing on the deck of a transport, the roar of engines growing louder, a formation of bombers bearing down at 50 feet above the water, so close you could see the faces of the pilots. Suddenly, the noses of those planes erupted in flame, each one carrying 850 caliber machine guns, spitting out a storm of bullets. Deck crews collapsed in seconds. Anti-aircraft guns fell silent. Men who had survived years of combat were cut down before they could fire a shot. Then, before you could even comprehend the devastation, you saw the bombs fall, not from the sky, but skipping across the waves like stones on a pond, bounding toward your ship with terrifying precision. The Japanese had prepared for bombs that fell vertically, for attacks that gave them seconds to maneuver time, to turn the rudder, to pray that gravity would be on their side. Nothing in their doctrine had prepared them for this. A single hit below the waterline could rip a destroyer in half. A transport struck by 2 or 3 would ignite in fire and roll over into the sea. In those 15 minutes, the Japanese Navy learned that the age of high-altitude safety was over. They were no longer fighting the old war. It was not just the firepower that shocked them, but the brutality of its delivery. At mast height, every gun round found a target. Every bomb that skipped across the surface seemed magnetized to steel hulls. Survivors recalled the sight of ships exploding in sheets of flame. Comrades thrown into burning seas, convoys that had taken months to plan, erased before their eyes in less time than it takes to boil a pot of rice. The power of the American B-25 had been transformed from a blunt instrument into a scalpel of destruction, and the Japanese, caught in those 15 minutes, could only watch as their lifeline to New Guinea was severed forever. What makes this story even more devastating is not just the carnage itself, but what it represented. In that quarter of an hour, Japan's confidence in its naval convoys was shattered. The men on those decks realized in horror that the war had entered a new phase, one where innovation, improvisation, and an industrial machine behind it all could collapse their empire from within. 15 minutes had changed the rules of the Pacific. 15 minutes had torn open the illusion of invincibility. 15 minutes had written in fire and steel that the ocean no longer belonged to Japan. And here lies the question for you. If you believe that 15 minutes can truly change the course of history, then write the number 1 in the comments. By late 1942, the Japanese Empire stretched like an iron fist across the Pacific. From the Philippines to New Guinea, from the Solomons to Burma, their flag flew over thousands of miles of ocean. Their strategy was elegant in its simplicity: build strong garrisons on conquered islands, reinforce them with troops and supplies carried in heavily escorted convoys, and grind down any Allied resistance through sheer persistence. In Tokyo, the admirals believed the sea was their shield and convoys their lifeblood. They had been tested many times already, and every time the verdict seemed the same: Japanese convoys would get through. For American commanders in the Southwest Pacific, the situation was nothing short of desperate. General Douglas MacArthur's forces were clinging to New Guinea by their fingernails. High-altitude bombing runs by American B-7 flying fortresses had achieved almost nothing. The mathematics of failure were written in cold statistics. A bombing raid from 20,000 feet stood barely a 2% chance of hitting a maneuvering ship. Convoy after convoy slipped through, delivering reinforcements, weapons, food, and ammunition to Japanese troops who seemed to grow stronger each month. For the Japanese, this became a source of pride and confidence. Their soldiers joked that American bombs belonged to the fish. Their officers reported back to Tokyo with assurance the Allies lacked the tools to stop them. To the men aboard those convoys, each voyage was dangerous but not terrifying. They had drilled for high-altitude raids. They knew the whistle of bombs that fell vertically, harmlessly, exploding into empty sea. Japanese destroyer escorts formed a shield around their transports, weaving tight formations, laying down anti-aircraft fire that deterred clumsy bombing runs. In 1942, alone, dozens of convoys crossed without serious loss. Each safe arrival fed the illusion that Japanese doctrine was invulnerable. The doctrine itself was rigid, almost ritualistic. Convoys moved in patterns calculated by the Imperial Navy, escorted by destroyers positioned at precise intervals. The guns were calibrated to fire upward at incoming aircraft. The crews trained endlessly to anticipate bombs dropping from the sky. No one in those fleets imagined that the real danger could come from directly across the waterline. The sea, after all, was supposed to protect them. At mast height, aircraft were thought to be suicidal targets, easy prey for flak and machine guns. The Japanese believed that no American pilot would dare fly into that gauntlet. What they underestimated was desperation. For America, conventional tactics had failed so completely that clinging to them meant certain defeat. For Japan, success had bred complacency, a faith in numbers that blinded them to innovation. Their admirals measured strength in ships' tonnage and guns. They could not measure creativity. The convoy that sailed in late February of 1943 carried not only men and supplies, but also the weight of that overconfidence. 8 transports packed with troops bound for Lae, New Guinea, guarded by 8 destroyers, their decks manned by crews who believed they had seen every trick the Americans could offer. They smoked cigarettes on deck. They wrote letters to families they believed they would arrive as all convoys before had arrived. They did not know that in workshops across northern Australia, American mechanics were tearing apart bombers, wiring new guns into their noses, and preparing to unleash a storm that no Japanese convoy had ever faced. The irony was cruel. The very predictability of Japanese movements, the very confidence in their convoys, was the reason they were about to be destroyed. American reconnaissance tracked their routes with ease. Radio intercepts revealed departure times and destinations. Allied intelligence knew almost to the hour when and where those convoys would appear. The only missing piece was the weapon to strike them effectively. That missing piece had just been invented. In Tokyo, the Imperial General Staff still believed the Pacific belonged to them. The victories of 1941 and 1942 had been so complete that defeat seemed unimaginable. They spoke in grand terms of a greater East Asia prosperity sphere, of an empire that would last for 1,000 years. They saw American bombers fail again and again, and they assumed those failures would continue. They assumed wrong. On the eve of March 3rd, the Japanese convoy cut through the night black silhouettes against the moonlit sea. Their escorts scanned the sky for high-altitude bombers, their gunners ready to aim upward, never downward. They had no idea that the real threat was coming not from the heavens, but from the horizon itself. They were about to face a weapon that broke every rule of naval warfare, a weapon born not of textbooks and doctrine, but of anger, desperation, and industrial might. The Japanese thought they knew their enemy. They thought they understood American weakness. They thought they had measured the balance of power. But when the sun rose over the Bismarck Sea, those assumptions would vanish in fire and steel. And here is where you come in. If you believe the Japanese were blinded by their own overconfidence, write the word yes in the comments right now. His name was Paul Irving Papy Gunn, and on paper he should never have been the man to change the Pacific War. Born in Arkansas in 1899, a sixth-grade dropout who had scraped his way into the Navy as a mechanic, Gunn was no general, no admiral, not even a graduate of a military academy. He was a man who learned airplanes from the inside out, who taught himself to fly in surplus seaplanes, who raised a family in the Philippines, running a small airline with 4 red Beechcrafts. He was by every measure ordinary. But war has a way of turning ordinary men into legends. And when the Japanese invasion tore his family away, his wife and children interned in Manila, his home burned. His airline seized. Papy Gunn became a man with nothing left to lose. The U.S. Army Air Forces gave him a commission, a rank, and a job. What they got instead was obsession. Gunn had watched from the ground as high-altitude bombing failed again and again. He knew you couldn't sink ships by praying to gravity 20,000 feet above. He understood that if convoys were to be stopped, it had to be done down where the spray hit your windshield, down where the ships had no room to dodge down, where courage mattered more than doctrine. To him, the problem was mechanical, almost simple. If bombs missed from high above, then bombs had to be brought down to the waterline. If machine guns couldn't suppress ships from a distance, then you needed more guns all firing straight ahead, so every bullet counted. In dusty workshops in northern Australia, far from Washington's regulations and procurement rules, Gunn began tearing apart perfectly good aircraft. He stripped out bomb sites and bombardier stations from the noses of B-25 Mitchell bombers. He scavenged 50 caliber machine guns from wrecked fighters that would never fly again. He and his mechanics welded, bolted, and jury-rigged those guns into the noses of bombers. Not 4, not 6, but eventually as many as 8 forward-firing heavy machine guns. When finished, a single B-25 carried the firepower of 3 P-51 Mustangs, all concentrated in one blistering arc of destruction. But guns alone were not enough. Gunn revived and perfected a forgotten tactic, skip bombing. It was as brutal in its simplicity as it was devastating in practice. Pilots would race in at wavetop height, release 500-pound bombs at just the right angle, and watch as those bombs skipped across the surface of the ocean like flat stones thrown by a child across a pond. Only these stones exploded with enough force to rip open steel hulls, tearing ships apart at or below the waterline where they were weakest. To skeptics, it sounded insane. Flying at 50 feet over open water meant entering the teeth of every anti-aircraft gun, every machine gun on deck. Bombs released too early would bounce harmlessly into the sea. Released too late, they might ricochet into the bomber itself. The margin for error was measured in fractions of a second. But when it worked, the results were devastating. Instead of watching bombs splash into the ocean, crews now watched ships erupt in fireballs. Decks shredded by gunfire, hulls split open like tin cans. General George Kenney, commander of the 5th Air Force, saw guns modifications in action and understood instantly. Here was the answer to the convoy problem, a weapon that could finally match Japan's strategy. Kenney gave Gunn carte blanche. Modify as many planes as you can, as fast as you can. Soon, entire squadrons of B-25s were converted into flying gunships, bristling with 8 forward-firing machine guns and armed with bombs designed not to fall from the sky, but to skim the sea straight into the enemy's ribs. The Japanese had no doctrine for this. Their destroyers were equipped to counter dive bombers and high-level attacks. Their anti-aircraft training taught them to aim skyward, not directly into the horizon. Their captains were drilled in evasive turns against falling bombs, not in watching helplessly as projectiles skimmed like torpedoes toward their hulls. Guns' invention rewrote the laws of air-sea warfare overnight. It wasn't just engineering. It was psychology. For American crews who had endured mission after mission of useless bombing runs, skip bombing gave them power. They could see the whites of their enemies' eyes. They could watch their bullets tear across a deck. They could feel in their bones that what they were doing mattered. For Japanese sailors, the effect was the opposite. War had always been dangerous, but now it was intimate, terrifyingly personal. A bomber was no longer a distant shape in the clouds. It was a predator screaming toward you at mast height, its nose spitting fire, its bombs skipping straight into your hull. The statistics confirmed what men on both sides already felt in their guts. Where high-altitude bombing had delivered hits in perhaps 1 or 2 cases out of 100, skip bombing hit in 7 out of 10. Where convoys once arrived intact, now they were graveyards. The mathematics of survival had flipped. Suddenly being on a transport ship in a Japanese convoy felt less like a duty and more like a death sentence. And behind it all stood Papy Gunn, the mechanic from Arkansas, the man who had lost everything and turned grief into invention. His 8-gun nose was not born in laboratories or corporate boardrooms, but in grease-stained hangars out of desperation and fury. He didn't just change the B-25 Mitchell. He changed the trajectory of the Pacific War. By early 1943, the stage was set. Gunn's modified bombers were ready. Their crews trained in the deadly art of mast-height flight and skip bombing. The Japanese were still confident, still certain that convoys could not be stopped, still unaware of what awaited them. In the Bismarck Sea, in less than 15 minutes, that illusion would be drowned forever. And now, a question for you. If you believe that raw creativity can be deadlier than doctrine, type OK in the comments below. The morning of March 3, 1943 began like so many others for the men aboard the Imperial Japanese Navy convoy. The sea was calm, the sun rising warm over the Bismarck Sea, the 8 transports steaming steadily toward Leh. On their decks, thousands of soldiers prepared for what they thought would be just another landing, another step in the long march of empire. 8 destroyers surrounded them, their guns polished, their crews alert. The officers reassured the troops American bombers might appear, but they always did, and they always failed. At 20,000 feet, bombs could not touch them. The convoys had never been stopped before. Why should this one be any different? Out on the horizon, black dots began to grow against the morning sky. At first, Japanese lookouts shouted the familiar warning, "American bombers incoming," but their voices carried a note of confusion. These bombers were not climbing into the clouds. They were hugging the waves, flying impossibly low, their wings skimming the spray. To the untrained eye, it looked like madness, as though the Americans had forgotten how to fight. Commanders barked orders to prepare for high-altitude attack. Anti-aircraft crews craned their necks upward, scanning the empty sky. Few aimed at the horizon where the real threat was racing closer by the second. 13 B-25 Mitchells bore down on the convoy, each one transformed by Papy Gunn's modifications into something the Japanese had never seen before. Their noses bristled with 850 caliber machine guns apiece. When the range closed, the air itself seemed to ignite. More than 100 heavy machine guns roared at once, spitting out a torrent of 8,000 rounds per minute. The decks of the Japanese ships became killing fields. Gunners were cut down where they stood. Men fell screaming into the sea. Steel shields sparked and shattered under the relentless hail. The sound was overwhelming, a thunderous ripping that drowned out every other noise. On one transport, soldiers huddled below decks, heard the deafening roar and the screams above. Some tried to climb to their posts only to be shredded before they reached daylight. Others cowered in terror, realizing they were trapped in a steel coffin. A destroyer's bridge erupted in sparks as its windows shattered. The captain and helmsman slumped over their controls. Fire burst from gun mounts. Ammunition cooked off lifeboats splintered before they could be lowered. And then came the bombs. At 50 feet above the ocean, the B-25 pilots released their deadly cargo. The first 500-pound bombs skipped once, twice across the waves and slammed squarely into the side of a transport. A blinding flash followed by a towering column of water and fire consumed the vessel. Another bomb ricocheted perfectly into the hull of a destroyer detonating below the waterline. Its back seemed to snap in half as seawater rushed in. Within minutes, it was slipping beneath the surface stern, raised like a drowning hand. The Japanese had never seen anything like it. Doctrine had prepared them for bombs falling vertically. Bombs that could be dodged by sharp turns and quick thinking, but no maneuver could avoid a bomb that skipped across the sea like a predator. In less than 2 minutes, the carefully rehearsed formations dissolved into chaos. Destroyers swerved wildly, transports broke ranks, and the ocean became a graveyard. From above, American gunners swept the decks with relentless fire, mowing down anyone who tried to man a gun or fight back. Survivors later described the horror with chilling clarity. They could see the faces of the American pilots through the cockpits, eyes locked on their targets, fingers steady on the triggers. This was not distant war fought by faceless machines. This was war at point-blank range, visceral and merciless. Ship after ship was struck. One transport burst into flames so intense that soldiers leapt overboard only to land in burning seas coated with oil. Another was split clean in two, the bow sinking while the stern floated briefly like a tombstone before vanishing beneath the waves. Within minutes, the convoy was reduced to wreckage. The statistics were staggering. 8 transports and 4 destroyers destroyed or sinking. 75% of the convoy erased in a quarter of an hour. Out of nearly 7,000 troops, fewer than 1,200 would ever reach their destination. The rest perished in explosions, burned alive in the inferno, or drowned in the cold embrace of the Pacific. Bodies bobbed among the wreckage lifeboats, overturned cries for help, fading into silence. For the Japanese survivors, the psychological impact was worse than the physical carnage. They had been promised that the sea and their escorts would protect them. They had believed that the Empire's convoys were unbreakable. But in 15 minutes, that belief was annihilated. Men who once laughed at American bombing raids now spoke of demons from the sea of planes that spat fire and bombs that hunted like wolves.